It is officially a new year. We're like 3 weeks into this new year. And someone came up to me this week and they asked me a dreaded question, I'd say. They said, hey, Lewis, I'm actually quite new to the city. And would you be up for joining me in signing up for the Great South Run? And I laughed and I sort of said, no, not really. What I want you to do, turn to the person next to you. Would you ever do the Great South Run? Or have you done the Great South Run? Turn to people next to you. All right, I'd love to know, just a show of hands, if you've ever done the Great South Run before. Guys, come on, give them a round of applause. It's no short thing. Brilliant. Personally, I really think the idea of doing the Great South Run now just sounds absolutely terrible. It sounds like hard work. But what's interesting is when I was growing up and when I was at school, one of my favourite days of the term at my secondary school was the PE cross-country running day. Because when I was younger, less so now in my mid-30s, but I used to play loads of football, really energetic, always on the move, and I was like naturally quite fit. And so every term, we would get the year group together out on the field, and normally it was like absolutely like torrential rain, freezing cold, and there was just puddles everywhere. And once a term, we'd gather together on this field, and we would then spend the next hour running a couple of laps around our school, up and down the hills. And there were some people that would start the cross-country run each term, like sprinting out of the blocks. And it was like as soon as the PE teacher blew his whistle, it was like they were like full pelt, off they go through the field and down the school, ready to do this hour of running. And then what was always interesting was that you would probably get halfway through the run and you could see those that have like sprinted out of the block that are literally like dragging themselves for the next half an hour. There were some people like my friend Dale that wasn't necessarily sprinting out of the blocks, more like outright refusing to do it, and would find any and every excuse during every PE lesson, and particularly cross-country PE, where it was like, nah, I've got a cold, nah, I've got a gammy leg, nah, and you just find any reason. It's like, Dale, come on, we're all doing this together. There were a group of friends that would take it to the next level, where they would, with full energy, really pretending to be up for this cross-country run. And there was this particular part of the school field that had this hole in the fence that was then a 2-minute walk down to the local Asda where there was a McDonald's. And what they would do is they would look like they're really keen, and then they would sneak through the gap in the fence, and then they'd spend the next 45 minutes at McDonald's and then come back being like, whoa, that was a really good run. Absolutely brilliant. For me personally, I loved the cross-country running, and I knew that I needed to set the right pace to make sure that I completed it in an effective time. And so those that had set out sprinting, I ended up halfway through just sort of like casually jogging past, like, morning, ready to go. And what I've noticed is a little bit like this cross-country run isn't life often a bit like this? That sometimes it feels like we have like run out of the blocks, full intention, full impact, full pace, full energy, and then life hits us with these things where we begin to tire or get disappointed or frustrated, or there's loss or there's grief, and we begin to slow down. For some of us, you might be a bit like my mate Dale, where you've just got to the point where you're like, I think I'm tagging out. Like I'm just plodding my way through or refusing to really step into it. And what I want to encourage us over these next 4 weeks here at Harbour Church is to think about this idea of what it means to be walking by faith, what it means for God to impact our life in the ordinary, every day, to journey through our life with hope and expectation of what God can do in us and through us. And to help us do this, to walk in faith, to, as Jesus said in John 10, verse 10, to live a life in its fullness, to be truly satisfied, to be truly filled with his peace and his hope, his love and his joy. How can we walk with faith into a life of fullness? And we're going to be looking at a particular character over the next 4 weeks, a guy called Abraham, who is a character in the Bible, part of the Bible called the Old Testament before Jesus. And you find him in the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And as we introduce Abraham this morning, and again, there might be some of us that you've been a Christian for a really long time and you're like, I love the story of Abraham. For some of us, we might be like, who on earth is this Abraham? And so I thought I'd give us just a really quick snapshot, a quick walk through Genesis this morning up until the point of Abraham. At the very beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we hear the creation accounts, that in its beauty, God made the heavens and the earth. Because of his deep desire for love and relationship, God creates and he makes humanity. He makes us. And in creation, God then walks around the Garden of Eden with his people, face to face, hand to hand, loving relationship. But then what happens is almost immediately is humanity tries to do it in its own strength. Adam and Eve grab the apple, the forbidden fruit from the tree, and humanity is cursed and falls away from relationship with God. And this is what we know in the church of what we call sin. The things that we do, the things that we think, the things that we say that separate us from God or from one another. And humanity is separated from God, and this separation spreads across the world. There is chaos and darkness and brokenness and murder, and it is all falling apart. And so God then starts again with, I'm sure, a story that we all know, the story of Noah and the ark and the flood. And God brings this water to cleanse the earth. It's a little bit like the symbol of Savannah being baptized this morning. The symbol of water is to refresh, but it's also to wash us from our brokenness and from our dirt. And so the flood comes, and then again, humanity gets it wrong, fighting for its own power, fighting for its own purposes. And then in the Tower of Babel story, God divides the people across the world. This is the backdrop of our story of Genesis so far, up until Genesis chapter 12. And here we then meet a man who technically is not actually called Abraham at this point. He's called Abram. And almost out of nowhere, God calls Abram to him and gives him a mission. And today, I want to speak to us about this promise that God gives Abraham. We're going to call it the covenant. And over these next few weeks, we're going to look at these different parts of Abraham's story. Today, thinking about this promise, this covenant. Next week, thinking about the cost to Abraham's calling. The character of Abraham, how it's formed by God. And then lastly, what we might be called to ourselves by God through this story. And so to think about walking by faith, this morning I want to think about the covenant, the promise of God. And we're going to read a fascinating story, an encounter between Abraham and God. And it's in Genesis chapter 15. And the words are going to come up on the screen. And it says this: "The word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward.' But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.' God took him outside and said, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars, It is indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he accredited to him as righteous. Abram believed this covenant, this promise of God, that Abraham would have a family larger than counting the stars. But the story goes on. God also said to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, and this is where I say it gets a little bit Old Testament and a little bit funky. The Lord says to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. It's like a little farm bubbling away here. Abram brought all of these to him. Apologies, gets a bit graphic. Cut them in two and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Lucky them. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. What on earth is going on? God has made a promise to Abram that he would have a family bigger than the stars that you can count across the universe. God gives Abram a promise that he will have a land to draw this family into. And then God, in this graphic way with animals and a vision and a smoking pot and fire, speaks this covenant over Abraham. What does that mean? And what does it mean for us today? Firstly, God is the promise maker. God speaks to Abram and he says, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward. This promise is not just for Abram, but is for each and every one of us. That God, in his beauty and in his majesty and in his power, wants a relationship, a deep, intimate, connected relationship with each and every one of us. And God speaks this over Abram and each one of us, that God promises to be your shield, to be your protector, to be your provider, to be the one that comes close, that loves you and heals you and transforms you. And then he says that he will be our great reward. Do you notice that in this promise to Abraham, to each one of us, this promise isn't external rewards of following God, that the great reward is God himself. As we step into 2026, I believe for me personally, and my invitation and challenge for each and every one of you, your greatest priority this year is to know the reward of Jesus. Not even what Jesus can do for you in his protection or his provision, but simply just to know him. Because he is so beautiful and so kind and so generous and so lovely and so transformative to us and those around us. It's not what God necessarily can even do for us. It's just exploring him more and finding out who he is. And then God says this promise, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, so shall your offspring be. Now the context is that Abram is a very old man and his wife is a very old lady, and they are like naturally beyond giving birth. But God says this promise to Abraham that your offspring, your family will be greater than the stars. And I just want to encourage us, what do we do when God's promises for us just don't seem to fit the reality that we sit in? And what's amazing is that I think God speaks something beautiful in this passage, that he acknowledges Abraham's doubt, Abraham's disappointment, Abraham's difficulty, And it's not that he's like correcting, he's just showing up in his disappointment and doubt. I have no children, God. I don't know what to expect next, God. I don't know how you can turn up in this way, God. And God gives him this promise because God is a promise maker. And I wonder for you, this week, the rest of this month, this year, what promises is God speaking over you to show you his love and his protection and his provision? God is the promise maker, but secondly, and so importantly, God is the promise keeper. You might have been asking a question during our passage. What is going on with all these animals? And what is going on with the fire pot and the smoke and the fire and the vision? Anybody reading the Torah, the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Bible, when they hear in Israel this story, they will know exactly what is going on and what it means. Because in ancient history at this time, for the people of God, for the people of Israel, this scenario of animals being sacrificed and cut in half and put into either side and is actually the form in which a contract was signed up. This is like the signing of a contract. This is the way that kings and people and individuals would make a covenant, make a contract, make a promise. So they wouldn't just wheel a contract out, which you sign, being like, cheers, contract signed, off we go. Is in a slightly more graphic and more poetic way. What would happen is maybe, let's say, between 2 individuals, if they're making a contract, a promise with one another, or particularly if you think about maybe a king leading his people, how the king will behave in this contract, this promise, and how the people will behave in this contract and this promise, is what they would do is they would take these animals and they would cut them in half, and then they would spread them evenly to 2 sides, and then leaving this, a little bit like church this morning, this alleyway down the middle. Maybe you guys can be the heifer and you guys can be the goat. No. And what would happen is that each part of the contract would journey through this alley between the dead animals, and what would happen is they are ultimately contracting themselves, promising and making the declaration that if I don't keep my end of this deal, this promise, this covenant, may I be like the animals that I'm passing through. May I be struck down and killed if I do not keep my part of this contract. And so the first part would walk down the alleyway saying, if I don't keep my part of this deal, may I be like these animals. And then on the other side, the king or the other individual would then also walk through the animals and through the blood, and they would make their way through, and they would say, if I don't keep my end of this deal, may I also be like these animals. This is how they created a contract, a covenant, a promise with one another. So what's happening with the next part of the vision of the fire pot and the blazing torch? Because Abraham is put into this sleep, and in this dream and in this vision, he sees firstly this big fire pot of smoke journey through the animals. And then coming down the other side is fire making its way through. And in the Bible, the image of God is often represented by fire and smoke. And so what God was saying to Abraham is that you will never be able to keep your part of this deal. You will never be able to behave well enough, to be holy enough, to pray enough, to read your Bible enough, to tell people about Jesus enough. You're not going to be good enough in your life, in your decision making, in your thoughts about yourself or others, in the words that you speak to one another. Abraham and each one of us, you will never be able to keep your part of this promise. And so I am going to walk through for you. I am going to keep this promise for each one of us. And God says to Abraham, if we cannot keep this part of the deal, may I be like these animals. This is so beautifully seen thousands and thousands of years later, when God himself, in this promise and in this covenant to Abraham, shows up in his son Jesus. And what we see this morning is the cross of Jesus. This is the Jesus that we worship. This is the Jesus we want to meet, is that we can never keep up our deal with being in relationship with God. We are always going to be broken. We're always going to be making bad decisions. And so Jesus becomes like the animals in this promise. And God himself, to show us his love, is torn to pieces and hung on a tree to complete this covenant promise that God made at the very beginning of time with Abram. It's a beautiful image, a beautiful story, but a beautiful reality that there is nothing we can do to earn God's love. It's God keeps his promise and he does it for us. And so you don't need to strive for a relationship with God. You simply need to be a promise holder. Abraham was never good enough for this relationship with God. We are never good enough for this relationship with God. But Abraham held on to the promise. And we are all invited to just simply hold on to the promise that God has for us, that he is our shield and he is our great reward, that we can spend time with him and he will always come close, because nothing can separate us from the love of God, because what of Jesus has already done for us. And so the invitation for us is to simply trust and believe. God gives Abram this promise, and it says, Abram believed the Lord, and God credited to him as righteous. You don't need to strive or behave. You just simply need to believe in Jesus. And God credits you as righteous and holy and complete in his sight. If you just simply come and step into relationship with God and believe in his promises for you, to trust in his promises for you, then he will transform you from the inside out, and he will transform our city. Because I want to ask you the question as we finish. Have you noticed in your own lives or your own relationships that the more that you trust someone, the less details that you need? So, for example, my wife Louise, if we're in the house and she just goes, just going to pop out. Like, I love Louise and I trust her, and I'm like, all right. If my 5-year-old Nora said, hey, Dad, just going to pop out, I'll be like, right, you're quite young and I'm going to need some more details. Just the other night when we had our wild storm, and it was like the wind and the rain was just crazy in Portsmouth and across the UK. And my daughter Nora, she woke up because of the wind quite early in the morning. And she started crying, and so I sort of dragged myself out of bed. I was going to pretend to be a good dad then and be like, I sprinted, but I literally just like, oh, I'm sure she'll be fine. It's just a bit of wind. I dragged myself in, and I went and sat next to her by the bed. And what was amazing is that as soon as I came close, she calmed down in the storm. And she didn't even have any questions about the storm. She just trusted that her dad was close and that it was going to be okay. And for us to be promise holders is whatever you are facing in your life right now, the things that you are celebrating or the challenges that you might be facing, is that you're invited to come close and believe and trust in God. Believe in his love for you. Believe in that relationship that he wants with you, to come and explore it. And for some of us, we might be so new to this that we might need a bit more detail. Come and do Alpha, or come and join the Foundations course and find out more so that you can put even more trust in your Heavenly Father who loves you and made you and wants a relationship with you. Or for some of us that you've been journeying with a Jesus for a while, and he's asking the question, with whatever you're facing, how can you just believe and trust and come close to me that bit more to experience more of him? And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to worship and we're going to pray. And we're going to invite that God that gave the promise to Abraham and gives that promise to each and every one of us to come and meet with us. And so if you're over, why don't you stand? I'm going to invite Timothy and the band up this morning. And what we're going to do is we're going to simply just ask for God's presence to come and meet with us as we worship him. That he is the promise maker, the promise keeper, and that we are invited to hold that promise in our hearts.